So hello and welcome back after the break. I hope you enjoyed the break and also had maybe some nice chats in the networking hub. And now we move on with the session on risk governance. We do have a couple of excellent speakers also for this session. So the session is coordinated by Martin Himli, together with his colleague Sabine Hofer, Norbert Hofstetter from University of Salzburg, and we also have Dimitri Czorny from Germany, the Bundesanstalt für Materialforschung und Prüfung, and also Dan Scubiers from the Fabrik in the Netherlands. So they are all part of the NMBP 13 risk governance project. And the session more or less focuses on the topic risk assessment with social dimension. How does risk governance differ from risk assessment or management, which we just heard before in the session from Alex? So with this, I would like to hand over to Martin. So Martin, the stage is yours, and please also introduce the session program.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon session on risk governance. We are very glad to be attending and presenting at the, as I was calling it, virtual Venice Nano School. And what we are going to have in mind for you today, this afternoon, is to make this bridge from risk assessment or management, which we have just heard about in the past session, to the social dimension of risk governance. So let's do this bridge together. I'm, by the way, also the chair of the working group A of the NanoSafety cluster on training, communication, and education. And if you are interested in our program, stay tuned with us. Join the mailing list of the NanoSafety cluster working group to get more information. So this is going to be on stage for the next 90 minutes. So we are going to have an introduction into risk governance and have an interactive session. So please work with us in using the discussion forum on what risk governance is different from risk assessment or risk management. And then we are going to have a kind of a data block. So we look into scientific and technical assessment, which is requiring data from the scientific community. So make your data fair and also take care of quality assurance, quality control of data. And this is also going to be the topic of the CAL concept. So we are introducing you to CAL, a new concept which is just at the edge of emerging. And we are going to, in an interactive session, apply CAL. Judge a couple of data sets and look on how mature these data are and how relevant we can deduce information from such different data sets. In the end, big block on the social dimension, as this is a very important issue of risk governance, which we will see. And there will be also a kind of an interactive part of it, where we look into a couple of different stakeholder views that we might come across in different cases. Good, so hopefully we get a good take-home message for all of us and enjoy the show. And now we're gonna start with the first recorded presentation given by Sabine Hofer from the University of Salzburg.
Hello and welcome to the talk on risk governance and its application on nanotechnology. This talk will explain why risk governance is far more than assessment and management of risk. Risk at the time of emergence is associated with risk characteristics, and the initial perception of these characteristics refers it to a category, but the categorization might be transient and evolving over time during the life cycle. A risk can be simple and managed by routine strategies and decision-making, or being a composition of risks, thus being more complex and requiring risk-informed and robustness-focused strategies. Bounded knowledge, data gaps, and poor data quality may classify a risk as uncertain, increasing the appropriateness and precaution-based strategies. Finally, ambiguity implies the demand for risk absorption and resilience-focused strategies. An analogous escalation is needed at the site of the risk discourse. Simple risk can be targeted by an instrumental approach, while uncertainty and ambiguity need broader participation of stakeholders. The multidimensionality of risk, the complexity and variety of strategic options to deal with risk, and the mandatory scientific and social discourse cannot be covered by the means of traditional risk assessment and management. Hence, a cross-linked or circular approach overarching the risk life cycle is indispensable. This endeavor is termed risk governance and is summarized by the International Risk Governance Council IRGC as follows. Governance includes all the actions, processes, traditions, and institutions by which authority is exercised and decisions are taken and implemented. Good governance is based on participation, accountability, transparency, responsiveness, equity and inclusion, efficacy and efficiency, and the rule of law. And risk governance applies the principles of good governance to the identification, assessment, management, and communication. The IRGC risk governance model absorbs risk management and risk assessment within two hemispheres, the assessment sphere, where the generation of knowledge is the predominant task, and the management sphere, where decision-making and implementation of actions is the focus. Risk appraisal, the centerpiece of the assessment sphere, targets knowledge generation on the technical aspects of risk by means of classical risk assessment and by concern assessment, addressing questions of a wider political context and afflicted stakeholders. Risk management, the centerpiece of the management sphere, supports decision-making and subsequent implementation of appropriate measures. However, this model already unveils the need for shared tasks because pre-assessment has to be involved in both domains, thus linking the management sphere with the assessment sphere. The same can be said about the tolerability and acceptability judgment, where risk characterization, a task of the assessment sphere, is bridged to risk evaluation, a task of the management sphere, thus either concluding the appraisal phase or marking the start of the management phase. Risk communication finally cross-links all tasks, suggesting the need for core functions and supporting tasks. Based on the IRGC procedural framework, an advanced nano-risk governance framework, NRGF, was established by the Horizon 2020 funded NANORIGO project and presented by Arthur Semanen and his work package team. 6 steps arranged in circular order and supported by core functions are the main characteristics. The unique selling proposition of the NRGF is the perspective of user guidance for all 6 steps, managing the variety of questions and different levels of capabilities of expert and non-expert stakeholders. The NRGF integrates validated methods and tools that are proposed to improve available practices for safety and risk management. The users of the NRGF can directly access high-quality data that are fit for purpose and propose resources such as tools and methods. Let us now walk through the individual steps. The purpose of pre-assessment is to frame the risk, to place an early warning, and to prepare for handling the risk. Pre-assessment involves relevant actors and identifies potential stakeholders groups for subsequent inclusion. It has to capture the various perspectives on the potential risk, but also its opportunities and strategies for addressing it. Pre-assessment is setting the stage in the risk governance process. Erroneous decisions at this point of framing are the most critical, because here the agenda for the subsequent steps is defined. Scientific technical risk assessment. The purpose of this step is to perform an analytical and technical assessment and to collect existing information about nanomaterials hazards, exposure and vulnerability of affected populations. Probability of occurrence and extent of harm and severity of consequences must be assessed through appropriate models for human and environmental risk assessment. Risk assessment synthesizes the knowledge base for subsequent decisions, including what options are available for preventing, mitigating, adapting to, or approving the risk. Information for risk assessment studies is provided by particular safety studies and agreed upon methods, but due to the complex nature of nanomaterials, these may be finally insufficient for an unambiguous risk assessment outcome. Concern assessment has to identify the opinions, perceptions, and concerns of directly affected stakeholders, but also the socio-economic impact and economic benefits or harm of indirectly affected populations. Uncertainty in the context of new technologies raises the bar for the acceptance of nano-based products because human behavior and decision-making is driven by bounded rationality. This makes clear that inclusiveness, being heard, and informed participation of relevant stakeholders is the key in this stage. Information is the key to align perception-driven decisions with decisions based on the outcome of a technical risk assessment. Risk evaluation is a phase of reflectiveness and accountable judgment, reviewing and weighing the outcome of pre-assessment, technical risk, and concern assessment with criteria accepted by science and society. It collects and summarizes information of all three preceding steps and reflects it from a decision-making perspective. The final target is to prepare a foundation and to propose a strategy for the risk management phase, which can be led either by the principles of precautionary or being dominated by the strategy of risk acceptability, risk sharing and mitigation, hence enabling responsible innovation. However, acceptability is frequently a matter of trade-offs between risks and benefits on a qualitative scale. Risk management is a process that addresses the treatment and regulation of a risk by development and implementation of the actions and remedies required to avoid, retain, reduce, or transfer the risk. For standard risk, standard management instruments are frequently available and have to be appropriately evaluated, selected, and adopted. However, sometimes an accepted and harmonized approach is not available. Thus, the design and generation of new risk management options may be needed. An implemented risk management strategy has to cover the whole risk lifecycle, thus is made to last. Monitoring of risk, monitoring the implemented risk management strategy and measures is critical, in particular to keep up with an evolving technical and regulatory environment, changes in the societal perception and tolerance to risk or increasing uncertainty or ambiguity on emerging new evidence. A flexible governance process allows the integration of new concerns and findings in a transparent, fair and fast manner by regular feedback to and collection of feedback from all participating stakeholders using methods provided by the NRGF core functions for communication. We hope this gave you a helpful insight into risk governance and would like to thank for your interest. We would also like to express our gratitude to the funding authority Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. Thank you.
Time for some live reflection on risk governance. For this purpose, we have prepared 2 questions around 2 potential nanoparticle risk cases. What would we miss without governance on these cases? What are the representatives of governance in these cases? Both cases deal with rubber tires. In both cases, nanoparticles are removed. In the first case, there could be an environmental risk, but also an occupational risk for road workers. In the second case, nanoparticles are released and washed out from the play field with perhaps substantial concentrations to water outflow. The question of risk to the environment may emerge. Please think about these cases and share your ideas, your opinions, and your key takeaways using the discussion forum so that your colleagues, the other participants, and we also can wrap it up and discuss it. So please go ahead.
Who needs to be involved in the process? For whom is this of interest? Who could be of...
Are the acting stakeholders different in risk governance, in risk management, in risk assessment? Which stakeholders come in play and when?
For whom could this be of interest? Else than risk assessors? What could we miss? I mean, looking at football fields, this might be relevant for parents. Do they have a voice? The parents of the kids playing on the football grounds?
Who might be concerned in both cases?
Well, the citizens who live at the street.
Do we have a process for involving them in this assessment, management?
Who will start?
At what stage?
Who will start these cases? Experts, societal stakeholders, non-governmental organizations?
Or the industry? Are they interested in changing something? Or politicians? What do you think?
What is the medium? How can they express their concern, if there is a concern? Do they have to write newspaper articles and go to press? What's the process here? Is there a process? Is there a strategy behind?
Are there particular interests, conflicting interests? How could this be managed? Do we need participation, inclusiveness? Where does all this come from? Who could organize it? All a matter of risk governance, not a matter of risk management, we think.
Or do you think it's enough if the scientists say it's harmless? Is that enough?
Can we believe them? Can we trust them?
Is there trust?
What happens if it turns out after years that there is an environmental concern about it? Where does the stuff go if it is built into the environment? Who is going to pay for it? Okay, so we got some answer from the audience which says NGOs are usually bringing the issues in the spotlight. Okay, so NGOs are obviously somebody who is trying to get involved in such kind of processes. Okay, I guess at this stage it was nice already to warm up a little bit for this kind of content that we would like to build on further more and more. And next, I guess we are going to look into, the scientific side, right? Let's take the next step to the data. And we scientists need to provide reasonable data. So I guess it's maybe the good time point now to switch on to the next recorded session. And there will be two sessions on data, and then we come back to discussing these issues, then hopefully then more lively than now. And I'm looking forward to that already. We are now entering the process of risk governance, and we know that in the first step we do have to conduct pre-assessment of our process to define the entire process, the risk governance process. However, next we proceed to the second step, which is the scientific and technical assessment, and this stage can just be conducted on the basis of reliable data. So we require your data, the data of the scientists, and by tools can evaluate on a scientific basis the risk. We do this under the premises of the FAIR data initiative, and therefore we talk about fairness now and about quality assurance, quality control of data. Nanotechnologies are very important, and they are a huge investment and important for the growth of the European economy. We know that the data on the safety issues for nano are fragmented still, and this is hampering the progress in nano-safety assessment. Read-across approaches are currently still not fully available, and therefore NanoCommons project has taken the initiative of trying to collect different data sets, different data formats, trying to harmonize that, and including huge data sets from different projects that they are depicted here in a kind of a way that they can be interoperating with each other. So it's a kind of an e-infrastructure platform to be established to provide a reproducible science, and should enhance the data integration and enabling nano-informatic workflows to be integrated to in vitro experimentation. This is set upon the initiatives of fairness, data fairness. What does this mean? It's making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this shall, on the long run, remove barriers for regulators as well as for industries. We need to integrate knowledge bases. The NanoCommons knowledge base is one of them, but there are also other ones existing to facilitate grouping and read across for nano-safety data. So we need to interconnect our community in a kind of a fair data single market. And by this means, we might then be able to have a much better exploitation of the EU-funded research data. The data landscape, as I was initially saying, is still a fragmented one, to promote data-driven innovation, and that would, on the long run, lead to a very positive socioeconomic impact. So this is somehow, of course, covering the entire data lifecycle. What we are, as experimentalists, used to is doing our experiments and then eventually evaluate our experiments, do some analysis based on the data that we have obtained, in some ways also visualize and use tools for visualization of our data. Establish also the means that other people can, based on this data,
conduct predictive toxicity assessment. And then we need to facilitate storage of our data and give online accessibility to that in a fair way. But this is a life cycle. On the basis of this data, other people can work upon. So we need to consider, in order to make this cycle be running all around, how rich our metadata shall be. What is metadata? Data describing our data, and then thus making that understandable and reusable. So we consider the R of the fairness process. So how rich, how shall we collect metadata that we can achieve these high standing goals of providing fair data to the community. Just a few more comments. Data management plans are an urgent necessity to be included in EU projects. To establish data management plans or research outcome management plans, a new term, a new kind of role has been also developed, which is the data shepherd. And you can see here from all the different objectives that might be seen during the data life cycle, from the more kind of acquisition of the data until to the data storage and reapplication for different formats, that many different roles can be defined. And the shepherds is one role that has to have some expertise in many of these, or in actually all of these different topics. So this data shepherd drives this process from the planning and from being integrated already in the planning of the procedure of the experiments, being participating in acquisition, processing, analysis of the data, but all along to storage and fair sharing to drive the cycle, the data life cycle, for a profit of each of the other customers. So how can this look like in a very concrete example? One example, you have a research question, like, for example, to look at the protein corona formation of different particles with different proteins. And you are interested in, is there some selectivity in binding? How about the orientation of the proteins around, other structural alterations, and so on? This is just our research question. And you would start in your project with the synthesis of the materials, of some surface functionalization. Then you do some proper characterization. You use your knowledge base, like, for example, the NanoCommons knowledge base, to upload and provide in a fair means your data. Also make some modelings on your obtained physical-chemical characterization, like, for example, image analysis to provide further nanodescriptors for that. You could then also, from this knowledge base, for example, enter to corona modeling to integrate in silico and in vitro data. So in this way, try to establish a kind of an integrated in vitro in silico workflow. And then go along with all your experiments for the functional assays, structural assays that you plan for this project, until you come to the issue of data storage, to do also annotation of ontologies for the different endpoints that you use in a fair way. And this all can be powered by the NanoCommons knowledge base. Okay, so next we're gonna go to the NanoCommons knowledge base, which is provided by the Biomax knowledge portal. We need to click the URL given here on the right upper corner. Okay, we clicked NanoCommons URL and have arrived at the NanoCommons homepage. Here you have access to many things. I would like to highlight shortly the previous events, where you have access also to teaching materials and training events that we had performed before. You find also teaching materials also in this user guidance handbook. It's a different way of assembling and finding yourself things along. But today, let's focus on the knowledge base. So here you have the access to the knowledge base. If you click on it, you get access to the portal. What you have to do is registering once, and I have done this, of course, and then you can log in, and I have done this before. This is the landing page. Here you see 4 activities. You can have access to data that are deposited there. Here you can result eventually characterizations or toxicity assays from bigger projects also, and can look up, for example, their metadata templates, which would be an interesting information eventually. You can also perform analyses, like, for example, the protein corona analysis, but also TEM image analysis, have access to ontology terms. They can browse ontologies. What we are going to do today, and this is now of interest to us, is data upload. So we can define particles, for example, by creating a new particle in this shell here. You would then be adding the chemical elements of your particles, give some description and a name for your particle. You can also do that by in spreadsheet format by having a whole list of particles to be defined all at once. What you can do here in the upload parameters button, you can also look up parameters that are there. So for instance, if you're interested in ontology terms, you could, for example, look up size. Yeah, and here you get the ontology term for size, for example, or PDI, or the dispersity index, ontology term for such type of parameter. So you look up whether the parameters are already deposited. If yes, then you need not define them. If they are not there yet, you can define your own parameters. But now we go ahead and do upload experiments. So for example, particle characterization, what you need to do here is then to download the Excel template sheet. That does look like. This is basically already such a format. So you need to then input the nanoparticle ID, which you have obtained from the knowledge base. You can define different instances. What is that? For instance, you do define or disperse your particles in medium, in water, or a medium containing proteins, or interacting with soil. This would be different instances of your particle, the history basically in your experimental workflow. And then you define the property, the parameter, like TM or DLS or NTA or something, and give the value with or without the unit. How does this look like? For two model examples here, this is not a real particle idea, so just XXX for one particle and Y for the other one. And you have the properties listed here. We do not have instances, and these are the values for the different properties. Standard deviation of TM and nanoparticle tracking analysis. You can also give input for shape, like the sphere here, or for coating. It's an uncoated silica particle versus the other one being an uptest coated, for example. Different values, theta potential values. Okay, and this data set you then upload into the database. How does this then look like? If a real particle, for example, we have a glance on, this particle has been defined here. What you obtain is also the NINCI, so the nano-INCI code for that one, a little bit of description, the chemical composition, and for example, some data on this particle in the case of pH 7, for example, buffer. What you also have here, and you can upload the metadata. We can also consult this metadata for creating a template. To include all the parameters that are necessary. So you can here find some examples and have a look into. You would also be able to deposit the raw data, for example, for the. Yeah, and then these values are here also to be seen. And via the knowledge base, you can also, as I said already, perform analysis. As we have now seen in the NanoCommons knowledge base, how to define new nanoparticles, how to look up parameters, how to eventually define new parameters, how to use them, and how to define experiments and upload our data. I would like to finally give just some links to you, for example, the NanoCommons knowledge base, giving you also the access to the knowledge portal. The user guidance handbook I have mentioned, training events, teaching materials are available from there in our infrastructure. You would also find these kind of teaching events, teaching materials at the Elixir tests. Everything has been deposited at Zenodo. There is a NanoCommons and NanoSafety cluster community there where this material have been deposited. The NanoCommons and NanoSafety cluster YouTube channels also provides useful information, and I would like to invite you to join the mailing list of the Working Group A on Education, Training and Communication of the NanoSafety cluster NanoSafety cluster. If you are in need for further training or interested in further training, teaching events that we are going to offer. With this, I'd like to thank you all for your interest, and I want to acknowledge the funding agencies, which is the Horizon 2020 Research Innovation Program and the NanoCommons and NANORIGO projects.
Good afternoon, dear participants. My name is Dmitry Chorny, and I'm working at Federal Institute for Materials Research and Testing. Currently, I'm working at NANORIGO project, and today I will talk about data quality for nano-risk governance. First, I will talk about data quality criteria, which is important for nano-risk governance. Then I will make a brief introduction to technology readiness level. And after this, I will talk in more details about knowledge, information, and data readiness level, CARL, the approach developed in NANORIGO. And this will be followed by conclusions on how CARL could improve nano-risk governance. To be suitable for nano-risk governance, data need to fulfill certain quality criteria. Some of those quality criteria are represented here. When talking about completeness of studies or data sets, let's say an example, characterization of nanomaterials. Completeness means the availability of complete and relevant physicochemical characterization and also extent to which the experimental setup and methods are described and validated. Relevance is another important criteria, and it is nothing else than fitness for purpose. It indicates the suitability and appropriateness of data for a given purpose. A study can be, for example, relevant for one purpose and irrelevant for another purpose. As an example, in nanotoxicological study, relevance means covering the extent to which data or tests are appropriate for a particular hazard identification or, for example, risk characterization. Another important criteria is fairness. Maybe some of you have heard already about this. Representing findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. Fairness puts specific emphasis on enhancing the ability of machines to automatically find and use data, in addition to supporting its reuse by individuals. Fairness allows also machine readability and interoperability between different databases or data repositories and enhances the value of data and studies. Traceability is another very important criteria for data quality, and it means that the data or study or a piece of knowledge is traceable down to its origins, down to the very experiments when talking about scientific data. Traceability is considered as the highest standard for data quality and is necessary, for example, for regulatory purposes. Now I will talk about technology readiness level and knowledge readiness level. Technology readiness level, or TRL, has been developed initially by NASA in the 1970s and is a concept for evaluation of the readiness of a particular technology or system. This is a 9-grade scale divided into 3 blocks. First block is TRL 1 to TRL 3, refers to the basic research or lab phase. The second block, TRL 4 to TRL 6, refers to the development phase, and the third block, TRL 7 to TRL 9, refers to deployment. In analogy to TRL, we developed at NANORIGO knowledge readiness level, CARL. CARL is also a 9-grade scale divided into 3 blocks. CARL 1 to CARL 4 refers to the technical readiness of knowledge. CARL 5 to CARL 6 refers to the knowledge readiness for small scale. And CARL 7 to CARL 9 refers to the knowledge readiness for large scale. CARL 1 represents all available data in digital form or in text files stemming from all possible data sources, which could be databases or physical libraries, electronic lab books, and so on. One example of CARL 1 could be publications, let's say, on titanium dioxide. CARL 2 is considered data completed with metadata. And metadata, there are of different types: reference metadata, structural, statistical, bibliographic, or technical metadata. There are also some existing minimum reporting standards, such as Arrive, MIAME-TOX, Mirabel, MinChar, MIAN. All of those require from scientists to report also different types of metadata. For example, CARL2 could be a study which was carried according to MinChar, and MinChar requires the reporting of particle size distribution, agglomeration state, shape of the nanoparticle, functionalization, and so on. CARL3 represents data completed with toxicological context, which is very important for regulatory purposes. Recently, in Small, it has been published a nanotox metadata checklist, represented here on the right, which requires from toxicological studies to provide the toxicological data. For example, exposure, acute exposure, chronic exposure, or route of administration, data on toxicokinetics, decision points on hazard identification, and so on and so forth. So the more complete study is with toxicological context, the more suitable it is for regulatory purposes. CARL4 represents fitness for purpose of a study. Since there are also different purposes like scientific or regulatory, safe by design, exposure assessment, or other, there are different quality scoring systems like NanoCred, Guide Nano, Klimisch scoring, DANA, and so forth. Klimisch scoring is suitable for studies for regulatory purposes. Here on the right you can see the score grade of Klimisch scoring, and the studies with score 1, which are reliable without restriction, are suitable for regulatory purposes. Another way to score studies is DANA's literature criteria checklist, which requires studies to report physicochemical properties, sample preparation, testing parameters, standard operating procedures, OECD guidelines, and other. In CARL5, stakeholders get involved in the process of knowledge readiness. Basically, CARL5 defines a list of stakeholder-specific requirements. Let's say a stakeholder is interested in a risk-related question. For example, an industrial producer of, let's say, nanoparticles. It could have a question whether exposure to particles in the working environment is affecting the worker's lungs. So how to obtain the answer to this question? Maybe some occupational exposure to nanoparticles should be investigated, for example, legal requirements for these particular nanoparticles. Also, it could be necessary to provide in vivo data on the effects of nanoparticles on lungs or gather the literature on this data. He could need, for example, combined dosimetry approach or other tools or models for additional information on these nanoparticles. Also, new experiments or assays might be necessary to answer this question. Before we proceed to CARL6, I'd like to explain you what is an actionable document. Per definition, an actionable document is a written instrument or document on which an action or defense is founded. This definition comes from military, but can be also successfully applied for other areas. And some examples of actionable documents are represented here. It could be a meta-analysis or proposal or scoping review or some dossiers or reports or whatever. Making link to CARL5, CARL6 represents functional knowledge in a form of an actionable document. You have seen already a few examples of actionable documents. And an example of such document could be report on toxicity of nanoparticles for an industrial producer. And such actionable documents are normally prepared by third party, for example, a consultancy organization or by a stakeholder himself. Previously, we talked about CARL6 representing an actionable document for individual stakeholders, which means that such actionable document is designed for small scale. However, if we intend to produce actionable documents for large scale, for policy, for decision making, regulatory purposes, then we suggest a CARL7. Carl 7 is a level where a specialized governance authority or a group of experts is suggested to perform a quality check of an actionable document. This group of experts could perform, for example, completeness check of all the documents. They could perform traceability assessment, whether the data and studies and knowledge gained until now is traceable. Only then it can be considered suitable for further purposes, for large-scale purposes. So after performing the general quality check of such documents, additionally also broad context need to be included in the actionable document. So Carl 8 represents a list of requirements for all stakeholders. Here public, academia, industry, regulator, consultancy, NGOs and other stakeholders, all stakeholders are involved. Their requirements and needs are combined and analyzed and included in the actionable document. An example of Carl 8 could be a list of requirements including public opinion, design principles, which is nothing else than social and ethical implementations in nanotechnology, circular economy principles, safe by design principles, good governance principles, or impact assessment. Carl 9 represents finally the last level of knowledge readiness and represents basically the document including Carl 1 to 7 and the list of requirements from Carl 8. Such document represents the basis for regulatory decisions. An example here you can see a opinion of the Committee for Risk Assessment on a dossier proposing harmonized classification and labeling at EU level. This document stems from a CLP process, which I will be talking a bit later about. And if this document is combined with additional public opinions and design principles and circular economy principles, so all the requirements from Carl 8, then it can be considered finally Carl 9 and ready for regulatory decision making, ready for nano-risk governance. Finally, to sum up the Carl approach, it is divided into 3 blocks, mainly technical readiness, small scale and large scale. And again, to quickly recall each Carl separately, Carl 1 is all available data, Carl 2 is completeness with metadata, Carl 3 is semantic metadata, Carl 4 is fitness for purpose, Carl 5 is stakeholder-specific requirements on a small scale. Carl 6 is a functional knowledge. Carl 7 is quality check of functional knowledge. Carl 8 are requirements for risk governance. And Carl 9 are functional knowledge for risk governance. So how Carl could improve nano-risk governance? Carl could support any stakeholder in providing a guidance on how and where to get high-quality data. Carl helps to obtain reliable knowledge from data and a higher knowledge readiness for different purposes. It provides a list of useful nano-informatical tools to fill knowledge gaps. It suggests quality check of actionable document by a specialized trusted governance authority. And Carl also enables involvement of all stakeholders and addresses ethical, social issues, safe by design, circular economy issues, and sustainability. We gratefully acknowledge the European Union's Horizon 2020 for financial support of the project NANORIGO Grant Agreement 814530. Thank you for your attention, and are there any questions? Now, hopefully you all can hear me, and I know that the information about Carl is fresh, but still I would like to show you some examples of Carls. And so next slide, please. Yes, here we will stay a bit longer since here is basically the first attempt to make a Carl assignment table, since Carl is still in development and we are still working on it. But based on the information you have heard right now, I summarized on the left-hand side the requirements, and on the right-hand side the CARLs from 1 to 9. And you can use this table while practicing with me during the exercise. So first, just imaginary case. Imagine we have found a publication on, let's say, zinc oxide, but the section materials and methods is lacking. So my question would be, what CARL can be assigned to this publication? And since we're lack of time, I would give you, I don't know, 10 to 15 seconds to think about it, even though this exercise particularly is easy. So you can basically write in the discussion forum. Any ideas? Yes, perfect. Thank you, Burkhard. CARL 1, it is CARL 1 just because, as all of you know, materials and methods refer to metadata, and since it is lacking, we cannot assign it to CARL 2. So it has to be CARL 1 just because data exist, but they are not really complete. Now this is for the warm-up. Next case, we have found a study on DANA platform on toxicological effect of titanium dioxide nanoparticles depending on the surface functionalization and on the diameter of nanoparticles. Now, study was conducted according to OECD guidelines, and here's the question: what CARL could be assigned to this particular case according to the table? So, any ideas? Well, I mentioned before that we have found perfect. Yes, thank you very much. Why DANA? Why CARL 4? Just because we have used DANA platform, we have also toxicological context. And this is a study conducted according to OECD guidelines. Perfect. Thank you very much. I see that it works. Now, second example, a toothpaste producer wants to improve the recipe for the toothpaste. He has concerns about the chronic exposure on titanium dioxide, which is contained, for example, in this product. And the producer hires a third party to obtain needed answers and information to make a decision on the improvement of the product. Third party performs work and gathers all necessary information. And here's the question, what CARL could be assigned to this situation? It's sad that we cannot communicate out loud, but good that there is a chat. So again, the third party gathered the information on a question of a stakeholder. And yes, so what level could it be?
Maybe you.
Okay, here's seconds more. CARL 7. Well, CARL 7 would be too far, but still, thank you for the answers. This is the level where we just gathering information to answer the stakeholders' question. And CARL 7 is already a quality checked actionable document. And I didn't even mention that we have already a document. We just gathered the information. So this is the whole process. We've found the requirements to answer the question. And this would be CARL 5, as you can see in the table. And following directly CARL 5, the question is, third party presented now a short report on toxicological effects of titanium dioxide over a period of 20 years.
So now you could easily guess what Carl this could be. Yes, thanks for the pointer, Martin. Since I don't have control over the screen. So Carl 5 were just a list of requirements, and then we gathered it and packed it in an actionable document. Okay, maybe some help here. So we would consider this as Carl 6 because it is the information gathered in Carl 5 and formulated in an actionable document, which in this case is a short report. Okay, now we can hopefully move further to a more complicated case. A stakeholder is concerned about a certain type of nanoparticles and wants the revision of carcinogenic effect of those nanoparticles on a regulatory level. Basically, he wants European community to classify that nanoparticles as carcinogenic. After several steps of reviewing the information on toxicity and carcinogenity of those nanomaterials from reliable sources, after several rounds of public discussion and other stakeholder discussions, the document containing all necessary information appears on the table of European community, which will take a decision on new classification of this nanomaterial. Also, I mentioned here that such principles as circular economy, safe by design, have also been addressed. So what, Carl, do you think could be attributed to this situation? Eight. It is very close, since 8 is all of those I said before, but as a list of requirements. And 9 would be the right answer because 9 is already the document containing all of those. So they are basically very close. And as I said that we are still working on the assignment of Carl, 8 and 9 is basically the same. So you're right. Thank you very much for the participation. Now, Martin, we can go to the next slide. So now to make Carl's visualize, Carl 5, as I mentioned before, is a list of stakeholder-specific requirements. Next. Thank you. An industrial producer, for example, produces titanium dioxide, and he's interested whether exposure to particles in the working environment is affecting workers' lungs. So this example has been already in the Carl presentation. And now what do we do to achieve this Carl 5? Next, please. Now we have a stakeholder with a question. Okay, this is one condition. We can search for all available data. Then we should also check for some legal requirements. It is possible that we might use also some tools or models for this answering this question, or maybe even carry new assays and tests. So now let's go concrete. So we have a stakeholder. What could be next one? What could be the existing data? The existing data could be just in vivo data on the effects of titanium dioxide on lungs. And this existing data we could find from reliable sources. They should be Carl 1 to 4. Now, occupational exposure to titanium dioxide represents legal requirements. This we need to know the threshold of the concentration of the titanium dioxide, which is allowed per regulation. Next one. New tests, well, it might be necessary also to carry in vitro cytotoxicity tests on titanium dioxide nanoparticles. And also, particularly for this situation, it would be suitable to use also tools. An example of such tool was mentioned before, combined dosimetry or CODO model. So this helps us to estimate the exposure levels corresponding to the concentrations of in vitro. So if we now go to the next slide, exactly, I can show you how it more or less works. So we have gathered some data in vitro. Then we have gathered some existing data from the literature on the in vivo tests. And then we combine it with the CODO model to simulate the exposure concentrations. And from there, we can extrapolate the exposure concentrations for 1 year, for example, for a worker. So this, all these tools and requirements help us to address the question of the stakeholder. Next one. And following this, Carl 6 would be the formulated document, actionable document, helping the industry, in this case, the industry, to resolve its task. For example, it can be a short report or a table comparing exposure concentrations or a scheme showing comparison with regulatory requirements. So basically, the answer, this actionable document, helps specific individual stakeholder to solve his need or task. Next one. So, and how can it look? So if we have a short report or a table, so it could look like this. We have gathered some regulatory requirements to know the threshold. We have gathered literature data on in vivo experiments. We have performed in vitro experiments to show, for example, that it's not cytotoxic. And we have extrapolated the exposure levels using CODO model and calculated the exposure for 1 year. So this document would be CARL 6. But now let's move further to a more complex situation. I wanted to show you just a grasp of CLP for showing you the example of CARL 9. So CLP is classification, labeling, and packaging, as many of you may already know. And to fulfill the CARL 9, all levels before need to be achieved. So this is how we define them. Thank you. And here we have, do not be scared of this scheme. It is the whole process of classification of titanium dioxide, which started 2013 by a member state, France, which wanted to put titanium dioxide on the special corrupt list for evaluating or re-evaluating its carcinogenity, so its classification, how should it be classified. And after a series of processes, you can see, which took many years, we had public consultations, we had risk assessment committees, we had meetings of member states and all stakeholders. All of those participations and discussions and comments led to the final decision taken by European Community in 2020 that titanium dioxide should be considered a carcinogenic material type 2. We will come to this slide later. My message here would be that I would assign CARL 9 to the very last step before the final decision. So having all of those discussion of member states and public involvement, all of those documents gathered from hopefully reliable sources, or must be actually reliable sources, all of those documents which go to the European Community, this is a really high level, this is for regulatory purposes, and that one could be CARL 9. But as I told you, we are still in the preparation of CARLs, and when we will publish soon, it will be more defined. So now we can go further to, I don't know, who is the next candidate?
Yes, so since we have talked a lot about data now, and we have seen the CARL even applied for many or for a couple of different cases, which was very nice. Thanks a lot, Dimitri. We are now looking again into the social aspects, and for this we pull up the recording from Dan, who gives you an introduction to the socio-economic aspects of risk governance.
Hello, my name is Daan Schuurbiers. I'm the director of DPF, a consultancy for responsible innovation in the Netherlands. And I'm a partner in the EU-funded NanoRIGO project on risk governance of nanotechnology. And the main point that I would like to make in this presentation is that the effective integration of broader societal considerations is an essential condition for the success of nanotechnology risk governance. Risk governance is more than risk assessment. Decisions to promote, inhibit, or otherwise regulate new nano-enabled products or processes are not fully determined by the quantitatively identifiable risks, but are shaped by a host of wider economic, environmental, and socio-ethical considerations. In other words, scientific evidence is but one piece of the governance puzzle. And to give you an example of what I mean, consider the recent opinion from EFSA on the safety of titanium dioxide as a food additive. Titanium dioxide is used as a food colorant. Its function is to make food more visually appealing. It can be found in things like bakery wares, soups, broths and sauces, salads and sandwich spreads. After reviewing all the relevant available scientific evidence, EFSA concluded that a concern for genotoxicity of titanium dioxide particles cannot be ruled out. And based on this concern, EFSA's experts no longer consider titanium dioxide safe when used as a food additive. So here are a few things to note from the press release. The opinion revises the outcome of EFSA's earlier assessment from 2016. The assessment took into consideration many thousands of studies that have become available since EFSA's previous assessment, including new scientific evidence and data on nanoparticles. And Professor Matthew Wright, the chair of EFSA's working group on E171, said, although the evidence for general toxic effects was not conclusive, on the basis of the new data and strengthened methods, we could not rule out a concern for genotoxicity, and consequently, we could not establish a safe level for daily intake of the food additive. Note that the EFSA opinion stated that a concern for genotoxicity could not be ruled out because of uncertainty around the characterization of E171. This headline in The Guardian, however, concludes that food colouring widely used in the UK is unsafe. And Foodwatch, an NGO which has campaigned against the use of titanium dioxide in food for years, along with several other NGOs, states that the additive E171 is finally recognized as unsafe. The Titanium Dioxide Manufacturers Association, the TDMA, also responded to the EFSA opinion. It stated that the TDMA has fulfilled all data requests from the EFSA and has also contributed extensive new scientific evidence that confirms the safety of E171. So how does this relate to my main point that the effective integration of broader societal consideration is an essential condition for nanotechnology risk governance? The example highlights how the scientific evidence constitutes but one element in the debate on the use of titanium dioxide in food. All the stakeholders try to shape decisions on the use of nanomaterials. And the picture that you see here tries to map the different stakeholders involved in the titanium dioxide case against 4 domains: policy, science, industry, and civil society. In the top left corner, we have stakeholders from the policy domain. This includes the regulators, those European and national authorities that assess and regulate the use of substances. EFSA, of course, plays an important role here, but so do other authorities like the French Agency for Food, Environment and Occupational Health and Safety, ANSES, as well as the Netherlands Food and Consumer Product Safety Authority, the NVWA. And these stakeholders are different from what are called the policymakers, those in the European Commission and in all the national ministries who need to make policy decisions based on the evidence. Note that different departments like economic affairs, health, research, or environmental protection do not necessarily have the same priorities and may advocate different courses of action based on the available evidence. The regulators and policymakers in turn base their information on the evidence provided by science, represented in the top right corner of this image. Science, however, is hardly a monolithic body itself, but instead produces tens of thousands of papers in a wide range of related fields. So which information do we base our opinion on? And how do we determine the quality of the evidence? And what do we do in case of conflicting evidence? Civil society organizations, in the bottom right corner, will also try to shape policy outcomes. Being concerned with food safety and with human and environmental health, they advocate the precautionary principle. If there are uncertainties about the health effects of materials, they shouldn't be used. And industry, in the bottom left corner of this image, is directly affected by the opinions of the regulators and the decisions taken by policymakers. Here again, industry is not a monolithic body, but consists of a wide variety of large companies, SMEs, and industry associations representing manufacturers and downstream users. And as the previous slide has showed, these stakeholders will react to the opinions of regulators by offering further scientific evidence or alternative opinions. They may resist a proposed ban on materials that they use in their production processes and may argue that inconclusive evidence is not enough to take such drastic actions as prohibiting certain substances. The point is that risk governance of titanium dioxide doesn't begin and end with EFSA's assessment. The available evidence becomes the playing field of the stakeholders. And as a future risk assessor, you are a player in this game, whether you like it or not. And your objective, neutral data will be used by proponents and opponents to suit their arguments, whether you like it or not. In summary, what the case of titanium dioxide suggests is that, first of all, safety assessment of nanomaterials is an incredibly complex task. And please note that this is just one specific function of a single material. The debate among risk assessors underlines that there are still many uncertainties around the long-term effects of the material on human and environmental health. And these uncertainties do not just apply to titanium dioxide, but to the range of engineered, natural, and incidental nanomaterials in many fields of application, from food to consumer products and from paints to textiles. Now, if there are such uncertainties, we cannot simply assume that nanotechnology innovations will all be unqualified blessings. There are many examples of miracle materials from the past that have turned out to cause problems, like asbestos, microplastics, lead, antifoulants, pesticides, and so on and so forth. And we, as a society, need to make decisions about the use of such materials despite the uncertainty surrounding their effects. And importantly, this is not a purely scientific but a political question. Risk-benefit assessment is a deliberative process that should include the views and concerns from all stakeholders. So this is what I mean with the picture I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. The scientific risk assessment is but one element of the risk governance process that ultimately leads to decisions on the use of nanomaterials. This is not to say that safety is irrelevant. Safety is an essential precondition for public acceptance. We do want regulatory bodies who draw strict lines as to what is and isn't safe. But it is not the only thing that is at stake in governance. In other words, safety is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for effective risk governance. We have to become better at guiding innovation decisions in light of uncertain outcomes. That means weighing the expected risks and benefits of innovation in light of incomplete and uncertain data. As future risk assessors, you can play an invaluable role in helping make those better decisions. It starts with being conscious of the political nature of risk governance, so you can present your evidence not as the final truth that will settle all matters, but as an important piece of the puzzle to guide future decisions. All right. There was a little bit of latency on the video on my end, so to me it sounded like I was completely drunk when I recorded this video. I can tell you that that was not the case, and I hope that it was all fine on your end. But fully live now. It's the same background, different t-shirt though, and we have about 15 minutes still to go. And what I would like to do here, I had actually prepared a set of questions for you in the audience, but we're noting in this session that since we can't hear you, it's actually quite difficult to get a discussion going. So what I propose to do now is to, we will ask you the same questions, but I will invite my panel members, so Martin, Sabine, Dimitri, and Norbert, to start answering the questions. And you, please, participants, feel free to chip in the discussion, the discussion forum. So any questions you have for us on the governance issue, or any points you would like to make about the presentation or about previous presentations. I can imagine that this session, in a way, you know, the governance bit that I just presented might be a little discomforting, because it kind of tells you that the science isn't going to answer all the political questions that we have in terms of risk governance. But please feel free to post your comments. We'll be happy to respond. On to the questions now, Martin. Maybe you could just put them onto the screen. By way of introduction, it's kind of the little clip that I showed you kind of makes 3 points. It says, first of all, EFSA says, you know, we cannot rule out the concern for genotoxicity, so we cannot assume that titanium dioxide E171 is safe. Foodwatch, who has been fighting this for years and years, along with several other NGOs, says, well, you know, finally EFSA finally recognizes that E171 is unsafe. It hasn't any nutritional value whatsoever. So we don't know why it's in our food in the first place. It should be banned. The producers, however, the Titanium Dioxide Manufacturers Association, says, well, we don't understand this, because we've given EFSA all the evidence that confirms that E171 is perfectly safe. That's the political situation we're in. And put yourself into the shoes of a policymaker now. That policymaker needs to decide, should we ban this? Who am I actually going to believe? So the first question that I would like to put to you all, but we'll ask Martin first of all to respond. Be ready, Martin. Based on all this evidence and what we've seen thus far, do you think we should ban titanium dioxide, or E171 to be specific?
Well, you ask me, and I'm a researcher, of course, and I, of course, do not understand the situation. But I learned through this process of risk governance project that we are running through that obviously there are many different stakeholder views. And I'm just giving my stakeholder view, and we are usually looking on the data, and then we see data sets, and then we also experience that people are driven in their decisions by emotions. Yeah, and I have witnessed this case in the field or in France, where people are getting emotional about, and then I also have neighbors in my neighborhood that think, well, I don't want, my parents were saying that E71, this kind of crap thing in my food, I don't want that. It's a very hard thing to say about. The question is then also what comes next. If we ban something which is E171, what is the alternative then? Does this then mean that eventually something else is getting into the food to make it look nicer, more attractive, more appealing? So this needs to be considered, of course. I mean, I'm buying, for example, most of my food as I can directly at the farmer. Yeah, so I don't need eventually any kind of food additives. But it's a matter of taste. It's a matter of opinion, matter of view, matter of perspective. And so I'm at the moment taking the stakeholder view of the scientist, yes. Is there another stakeholder among us?
Well, you know, it's to put it a little bit more firmly, though. Let's suppose you're the policymaker now. Based on the three views that are presented here, what action would you take?
Information to the public. I mean, we need to do, probably scientists need to go out to public science to public events, let people know what 171 means, what it is, that they have it on their sunscreen, what it really does, how inert it is eventually. Information to make people be able to have participate in the decision making on a very empirical value level, I should say, on an empirical level.
All right. In the meantime, I will ask the same question to Sabine and Norbert. But in the meantime, I invite all participants to put what you think to this question in the discussion forum. It can be a simple yes or no. It can also be a more, let's say, a longer argument for or against. But just in response to Martin, before we move to Sabine and Norbert, I think, if you put yourself in the position of that policymaker, it's actually going to be, it's going to be a hard decision either way, because you can either say, well, EFSA is inconclusive, that, their conclusion is we can't say anything about the genotoxicity. But what if the policymaker then decides, we shouldn't ban this because nothing is certain yet. And it turns out, in fact, that in a few years from now, EFSA will find more evidence on this. They can't predict. So what do? On the other hand, if they follow the uncertainty directly and say, well, actually, we should ban, they might kill the whole industry. So, I mean, regardless from whether it's yes or no, it's always going to be difficult, right, for the person having to take that decision in a context of uncertainty. So, Sabine and Norbert, what do you think?
Yeah, from the perspective of a policymaker, it's really a strategy, I think, because it's not easy on which side of the balance you should put more emphasis. If you block it totally, you would block responsible innovation, because the consumer obviously wants products containing titanium dioxide. On the other hand, most consumers obviously have no idea that it is in the products which they buy. So I think we should come to a reasonable communication where the consumers must be more aware that this is a matter, this could be an arising matter, and they should be enabled by the policymakers to make informed decisions on themselves. This is what I would do, because banning it at this situation would be overstretched, to my opinion, because there is no strong evidence that there is any harm from real world situations. There is just a lack or a little bit gap in knowledge. And to block an industry with such an important component on this basis is, for me, too much.
Right. So if I can stay with you, Norbert, for a little while, and again, participants, please feel free to submit your responses if you have any ideas on this. But if we move to the second question, Martin, Norbert, could I ask you? So what if Food Watch comes back to you, and says, well, why should we take the risk? Because there is no nutritional value in E171. All it does is make our pastry puffs look shiny and bright. So what are actually the consumer's interests in having this product in? Why don't we just ban it?
Yeah.
What would you say?
It's really a serious question, because from the perspective of NGOs, Food Watch, you cannot ignore this argument that there is obviously little additive value. On the other side, from the consumer perspective, there is an additive value, because otherwise they would not prefer to buy just these products which include this matter. So
we also got some contribution now from the audience.
Yes,
there is
yes.
Luis, and who he was saying he would definitely not ban, obviously, regarding to the first question, and he would request more information, restrict the amount of titanium dioxide eventually used in the food as food additive, and involve the consumers in the decision. So involvement, inclusion in the decision-making process is a good suggestion. Yes.
Communication.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. The question for more information, though, I really kind of support that, because the evidence is still inconclusive. But this might also be a question to Dimitri and Carl levels, because the EFSA was saying we're actually basing this this opinion that we now have on tens of thousands of research papers. So what would you say about that, Dimitri? How could we bring the titanium dioxide inconclusiveness to the next level through Carl? Would you have any ideas?
Yes. So first of all, I do agree with both Luis and Alexandra. I've just read the comments about the reducing the amount of titanium dioxide, which can be used in the food additives. Yes. Now coming to your question. Well, Carl is about transforming data to knowledge, and certainly there are on this process, it is a long process, there are certain knowledge gaps, and we need to transfer data to knowledge. We need also human impact. We need experts involved in the discussion. We need also multiple participatory approach, which is Carl all about, so that we hear all of the parties. And yes, so basically getting really high quality data only. So we have now, just now, we are starting to have fair data. So this verification process, we have reliable data repositories like NanoCommons, eNanoMapper. We have all possible tools which are computer modulated, so it's not a random manipulation of data. So all of those combined help, like Carl also showed, to transfer the data, very data, to the knowledge which is reliable, which is traceable. Unfortunately, I did not talk much about traceability, but this is what needs to be offered to the decision makers. So such kind of data, and if we would have really reliable data and reliable knowledge, if we would have all of those I talked about in Carl approach, well, maybe industry would still interfere with this process, because it has, of course, its own interests. So it is, let's say, a bit lobbying, but they would not have the argument that the data are not complete, that the data are not reliable, that the knowledge is not suitable to make such decisions. So they would not have at least this argument. Yeah. So, yeah.
So the more you reduce the uncertainty, the less playing field there actually is for stakeholders. That's what you're suggesting.
For some particular stakeholders, yes. Every stakeholder has its interests, but at least on the side of the knowledge reliability, traceability, knowledge which we can trust in, it would be an objective. So if it followed, for example, ideally the Carl approach, then no one could actually argue that we cannot trust this data or knowledge. Still, there are some ethical issues, of course. How much can be used? Is it good to use for small children, or maybe it should be restricted only in the food industry? We do not restrict it anywhere, everywhere. These aspects are another story, but from the data and knowledge side of view, Carl would help, I guess. Yeah. Even though I don't think that industry would give up so easily.
I'm looking at the time. We have 30 seconds left, and I think Martin still wants to show a slide. So we need to wrap it up here. Great discussion, though. I could do this for hours, to be honest. And thanks. One final comment before I close to Alexandra. I'm afraid, Alexandra, I really like your comment, but I'm afraid for the policymaker at this point, there is no, it has to be either yes or no. So I think that's the complexity that I try to express with this discussion forum. But thanks anyway for your contributions, and over to Martin.
Okay, so for the very first, for the very last moments that we still have in our session, we would like to reiterate on this central part here. What is really important to get the data high level. It was reiterated once again by Dimitri just earlier, and to involve people as much as possible, all the different stakeholders into the decision-making process by giving information to everybody. Is there something else that somebody wants to add on that from our panelist group? If not, I hope that we work out a little bit on this topic, risk governance, what it is different from risk management, from risk assessment. In the end, it's probably the social dimension, as we have tried to highlight. And we also tried to highlight a lot, of course, on the data completeness landscape, which is a great endeavor, actually, for the future for all of us. So with this, I would like to give over to Susie.
Perfect. So thank you all very, very much for this highly interesting session. I enjoyed it very much, and I also enjoyed all the different presentations and the different aspects of this complex topic, as we discovered now. And also the discussion in the end was really interesting. So I assume if we would be face-to-face with the participants, you would get great applause now. Unfortunately, since we're online, you have to live with silence. But at least please take my big thanks for organizing and also running this session.